Welcome to season 2. Can you believe that?
Season 2.
Unbelievable. Of the Rum Ration podcast, where we dive deep into military history, seeking out the incredible stories of camaraderie and selflessness that define combatants around the world. Rejoy, as we wish our listeners all around the world the happiest of Happy New Year's.
Yes.
And Newton the cat. People might be remarking that we're together again, but we're not at the RCMI.
Not this time. No,
we are the
Rum Ration Studios.
I think we're at like Central.
Command Center. One of the command centers.
This is the Command Central. Newton is here.
Newton is here. Yes. And he does not wish you a happy New Year.
He does not. No, he's very contrarian. But we have a monumental task ahead of us today.
Yeah, that's right, Colin. Today, we begin the critical multi-part series aimed at dismantling a long-standing and frankly unfair historical narrative. And that is the misconception that French Canadians were reluctant or unwilling to contribute to Canada's war efforts in the two world wars.
It was two.
It was two. Yes, that is anyway. We know that the truth is far more complex and heroic, though.
Yeah, and Newton, just as where everyone's aware, he's a bit of a conspiracy theorist. He does not believe that there were 2 world wars. He thinks that's fake news. There was only one. And he was very, like a lot of us, he was in love with Hal when Hal Claypack came on and talked about that. And Hal pointed out that the 7 Years' War was the original First World War, global war. So that's kind of the position Newton takes. And I think we can all agree. We all respect Hal for that. So.
Yes. And please do not subscribe to Newton's blog. Subscribe instead to
Rum Ration podcast, of course. But to guide us through this intricate history, we're honored to have 2 exceptional experts joining us.
First, very excited. Yes.
Richard Garon, whose groundbreaking research challenges the traditional views of French-Canadian participation in the First World War, not the one you're talking about, Newton. And we got Julien Lehoux, who's an expert on the Second World War, specifically focusing on the Quebec battalions in the Battle of Hong Kong. Gentlemen, welcome to the Rum Ration podcast.
Well, thanks for having us. It's really my pleasure to be here with you guys today.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, we're so happy that you are joining us today. And yes, we are happy that they're joining us. So the first episode is our general overview of the situation. What we're using it to provide a solid foundation before we drill down into, both your specific research areas in later episodes. Now, before we go much further, though, Colin, I think it's important we give them a proper introduction, don't you?
That's right. And we're honored to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel, former full Colonel, Richard Garon, a good friend of mine, and an officer whose 37-year career spans the regular and reserve forces. Originally from Saint-Anne-des-Monts, he trained at the Royal Military College Saint-Jean, where I learned that his first words in English were "me too" when he was going through the line in the cafeteria, and he didn't know what to eat, so he would just say "me too." And apparently that's a very good dish because it's varied. It's not always the same thing. You think me too is the same as every... No. Depending on who you're following, sometimes you get different meals. So I thought that was important to know.
I think it's the original meaning of me too.
Yeah, but Richard went on to serve as an artillery officer, which we don't hold against him. A specialist in influence or information warfare activities, and a commander at nearly every level of the Canadian Army, from detachment right up to brigade. So his deployments include Haiti, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Afghanistan, and he's commanded several reserve units and the 35th Brigade, also known as the 35e Brigade, based out of Quebec City. And he's most recently asked for, and this is unbelievably selfless, a reduction in rank back to Lieutenant Colonel so that he could take command of the Fusiliers de Saint-Laurent. Outside of uniform, Richard holds a PhD in political science, and he teaches at RMC, ENAP, which is the École Nationale d'Administration Publique, and the University of Laval. And he has published widely on Canadian defense policy, military history, and the role of French Canadians in our wars. Bienvenue, mon colonel.
Yes, it's really exciting to have you here, I must say. And alongside Richard, we are joined by historian Julien Lehoux, based in Montreal. Julien holds 2 master's degrees from UQAM, one in history, one in museum studies. Always wanted to do museum studies. Oh, that's such a wonderful thing to get into. I'd be lost for years. Here I'm going off track again. And his academic work focuses on Canada's participation in the Second World War, particularly the often overlooked Pacific Campaign and the challenges of remembrance. And fascinating subject indeed. Since 2021, he has worked with Je me souviens, Canada Company's military history learning program, where he develops and delivers educational tools to help Quebec students connect with their military heritage. Julien's been a big supporter of the podcast from the beginning. Welcome to the show, Julien. We're so glad to have you here.
Well, I'm really glad to be here as well. Thank you.
I get the pleasure of running to Julien oftentimes IRL, as the kids say, out in real life, because Julien has been, believe it or not, key responsible for getting the Je me souviens teaching materials out to schools. They've touched almost 300,000 students.
That is absolutely amazing.
Now, when I say touch 300,000, that's probably not the way.
Not properly. So
it's impacted. It's impacted.
Impacted is the better word, I feel like.
Yeah. Please don't get us canceled.
It's funny how you say.
Well, don't get me canceled. You're talking about me touching kids.
How do we edit?
But for our listeners out there, that is a wonderful thing to follow, and they really should check it out. Je me souviens.
Yeah, jemesouvien.org for everyone. And they also have a new part for Ontario, because here we are in the belly of the beast.
In the belly of the beast, indeed. Yes.
And it's also equally successful going out there. Called Honoring Bravery, honoringbravery.ca. I recommend everyone to check it out. All right, let's get off. We're get back on track. Yeah, Richard. Before 1914, Canada already faced some pretty deep internal tensions.
Yeah.
Wasn't the beautiful land of milk and honey that we like to believe sometimes. What was the political and social environment for Francophones that they were navigating, making military service inherently difficult for them?
The answer is complex. First, the French Canadians have an ambivalent relationship with the military service. First, the service goes back to French colonial militia, and it's deeply anchored into the population. People don't realize it, but they've been serving for years, for generations, and still the same names that you see in let's say you look at some expeditions during the French and English wars, and the same names that you can see going to the Baie or Hudson Bay against, the fur trade. And the names are the same as the ones serving today in some of the reserve units in Lévis or Quebec City. So, yeah, there is a long tradition of service, but again, after 1763, then the military service became more English and overwhelming. Yeah.
Big word.
Overall, it was all in English. So, as you mentioned, I learned my English during military service. Same for the Francophones. So, but it's not only the French. It's you probably mentioned it also, but it's religion at some point, cultural, and different military aspects that you won't necessarily notice at first. So there was a bit of tension on the French language, but it's also military heritage that is a bit different, the socioeconomic constraint and cultural aspects.
So it wasn't just about loyalty, wasn't it? I mean, the structure was such that it encouraged more Anglophone participation, less Francophone participation. Would you say that was the lay of the land at the time, say around 1914 or so?
Well, before 1914, as I mentioned, the military service was deeply rooted into the culture. So even though the new military army for Canada was created in 1855, so that was a new system based on the British system, as a voluntary service, and people would get paid, trained, and have everything that you can for service. And that became the reality and started first between the War of 1812. But before that, the French had the habit of serving as a mandatory obligation because it was the system under the French regime. So all those old units or organizations, because there were not really units, and no units would be organized before 1855, but they were serving, as I mentioned, in the same militia environment or organization from generation to generation. So when the new system was created in 1855, and new units had to be created. So it took a bit of time for French organizations to set up, but eventually they formed. Actually, the Fusiliers de Soldat that I serve with now were created in 1865, but some of the bilingual units, such as 2nd Field Regiment in Montreal, was created in 1856. And I have to mention it, despite what the CGG say.
Oh, we love to hear
It's
this.
the oldest service unit. It's the oldest service unit, the 2nd Field Regiment in the Canadian Army. And that's another story. The 6th Field Artillery Regiment was created in 1899. So it took a bit of a time because the dimension was really different. Which French Canadian was, they organized around the seigneur or an individual that was voted and maybe popular or with the community. But again, with the new system in 1855, people had to create their own unit. And at some point, they had to pay initially for, organizing, even some weapons, traveling, things like that. So it took people that already a lot of money and had a position in the society. So it became that some of the units were created by rich Englishmen.
It's still very much an 18th century concept, isn't it? Where a certain landed, moneyed individual would raise his regiment, become the colonel of the regiment, and it would be known as Colonel so-and-so's regiment. Very interesting. That was carried over.
Took a long time before they let poor English farmers in like me to rise up to the ranks.
Yes, and now we know why.
You had to buy your own regiment.
Now we know why. Yeah. Yes. So
yes, and Canada wasn't one of the first among the British troops, to allow that and permit on the battlefield during World War I to commission people from the ranks and in large number.
Yeah, our regiment.
But again,
a big history of that.
Big history of that. Yes, yeah, very proud of that. In fact, yeah.
Sorry, we cut you off. You about to say something?
No, that's okay because I could talk for 3 hours on the subject. But again, language was one of the factors, but there was socioeconomic realities before the First World War and during First World War that kind of paved the way service was made. So we had rural units where people were gladly serving, a few weeks a year or some nights during the year, but serving full-time overseas to defend a country that you don't know, defend a crown that you had, again, an ambiguous relationship with. It was a bit different. And also, Quebec, at that point, remained more rural and less industrialized than, let's say, Ontario. So you had to have big families to run the farm, which were for subsistence farming and very small. So having one son or two sons or even the father leaving for war meant a lot of distress and probably losing the farm.
Yeah, I mean, Hal in our last episode, 31, he mentioned how, I think he referred to the French-Canadian mobilization system pre the conquest as the best in the world.
Yes, yeah.
And it's never been repeated. It said something like 12,000, if the numbers are right, out of a population. They could mobilize 12,000 soldiers out of a total population of 70,000.
And very quickly.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. So, Richard, so it wasn't just language, then you're saying. It wasn't just an English-French versus like the language itself. There was more to it than that, right?
Yeah, exactly. But just going back, just one bit, and I'm really glad you mentioned that, because French Canadians have been serving before First World War in numerous actions. And going back to the War of 1812, and people don't realize that, but mobilization was superior to First World War in numbers. And
really?
most of the lower Canada defense was based on French Canadians and Quebec units.
How interesting.
Militia units because at that time, remember, 1812, it's again the United States, and Upper Canada was majority populated by people coming from the state recently.
Loyalists.
So
Yeah.
the Crown did not trust those new arrivals and send the regular troops in Upper Canada.
Interesting. That's a very
Anyway, that's a
I love that.
Yeah. And of course, the threat is much closer,
Of course.
right? Rather than
Well, I mean,
overseas.
border
So,
to border. But
border. Yeah.
you know, you're talking about Upper Canada and Lower Canada here, so basically Ontario, Quebec. But we often hear about Regulation 17. Could you explain what that specific policy was and why it became a flashpoint?
Yes. So in 1911, Ontario decided that the English at school would be the language at school would be English. So
For everybody.
I don't know. Pardon me?
For everybody?
Yes, for everybody.
Everyone. Oh, wow.
Yes, including French Canadians, and there were about 500,000 French Canadians at that time in Ontario. Right. So language, but culture and access to religion was jeopardized. So some enthusiasts took that fight and mentioned that we have to fight our cultural survival in Canada rather than fight elsewhere on other foreign countries. So it became some kind of a flashing point, but for some people only. For the majority of the people, it was not really an issue that had an impact on their day-to-day basis, but it was something of an impact. But it was also a sign of other things. Because it became, how can I say that? A symbol for some enthusiasts, and it was very present in the press, but not really in the daily life of the French Canadians, especially in the eastern part of Quebec, where they had less contact with people in Ontario.
Right. Yes. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, but there's also like French Canadians weren't just in Quebec.
Yes.
Like, that's the whole point of this whole Regulation 17, and that's a shocking number. Like, I can imagine if you're a French Canadian living anywhere else in the country, how insulting that would be. And how deeply offensive that would be to you.
Yeah, because you're not going to war, right, and fighting for liberty in Europe.
No, that's fine. Yet people still serve, and especially because again there is social, cultural, and religious factors, and you can find in all the daily orders and the roll calls, French people would serve in Irish units outside of Quebec because they would respect the Roman Catholic religion. So there were many aspects that we don't suspect at first, and yes, we focus on that law, but again, there's many other aspects, and the dynamic of the population change that we will see. I don't know if you want to talk about it at this point, but between 1905 and 1915, 1.6 million people came to Canada. That's a lot of people because population of Canada in 1911 was 7 million. So to that, 1.6 million, most of them spoke English or German, Russian or other language, but they were all going into the melted pot of English. So other cultural group were also kind of reticent to those, those laws or tendencies to make one country English only.
Right.
That makes perfect sense to me.
But Julien, I can only imagine that because we're talking here 1912, fast forward 20, 25 years, beginning of World War II, all that's been solved, right? The French Canadians are treated perfectly, equal rights, everything's great.
Well, exactly. You just like put no. I'm like, but I'm just, but like, If you think the government is moving very slowly these days, it was like more so 100 years ago. 25 years later is just small change for that period of time. Really, things haven't quite changed between the First World War and the Second World War too. Um, so by 1939, yes, French-speaking units had to function with what was mostly an English-speaking institution. So we talked about this earlier. There was already existing French-speaking units in the Canadian military with the Canadian militia. There was some kind of rupture during the First World War, which the government preferred to build new units instead of just using the already French-speaking militia for the army, which I don't think kind of helped the propagation of French language within the
Right.
Canadian
Yeah.
army.
Yeah.
Everybody was just cantoned with the 22e Régiment instead of just being able to work with their already implemented units, such as the Fusilier Montréal or the Régiment Maisonneuve or other ones. So the military approach at the time was essentially, I'm just sorry, stepping forward. So yeah, during the World War II, there was like more inclination to use already founded French unit for the war. So the Fusilier Montréal, the Régiment Maisonneuve, and so on, instead of just being mobilized and just being used as training units for the 22e, were sent to Europe and they were sent to fight there. So I think really helped the situation in that regard. But essentially, like I said, everything rested on this one-way bilingualism where French Canadians had to master English to advance. So that basically brought the ceiling to any recruits who had no prior education. Some people, well, like Shaw, learn English in the military, so they were able to quickly pick up. But some other people were at learning difficulties or just weren't able to pick up a second language, were very, very quickly stopped in their advancement in the army. They were stuck as basically being soldiers.
Right.
Yeah.
In the day-to-day life, that made it so that, yes, everybody could just like informally speak in French amongst themselves. They could like give informal orders among themselves in French and so on. But when in the battlefield, everything will change. Everything will just go out of the window. Everybody will just speak in French because it was just easier to communicate when you're being shot at. Obviously, but
Yeah.
Nothing like the existential threat.
I cannot imagine just like some poor French guy trying to muster like an English sentence. I have trouble doing it right now. I can imagine doing so while being somebody is shooting at me. But besides this business, everybody will just like have to speak in English, like in official meetings or like in official order during training and stuff, official communication, so on and so forth. So yeah.
That's that all of a sudden puts everything into perspective, doesn't it? And Julien, I hope you don't get shot at very often. Just
No.
Or shoot at people who come knocking on your door in the middle of the night looking for a place to stay.
That's just a heads up of what you might expect in a couple of weeks. Let's go back to August 1914.
Yeah.
So that shot that rang across the world. All of a sudden, everyone's at war. The British Empire declares war. Richard, when Canada formally entered the First World War in August 1914, what was the immediate response from the French Canadian community? What was their reaction? And particularly from society, from the elites? How did they respond to this? Because the British Empire, just on behalf of all the dominions, all the colonies, said, we are now at war. So you're in, join up, let's go.
Was not a question. We look back at history with our today's knowledge, but at this time, it was the Commonwealth, and the Crown decided to go to war, and French elite and the population were as enthusiastic in Quebec or across Canada than other part of the population. That initial spark and support was pretty good. It was later that all the other questions and frictions created the myths of resistance. But initially, support was there. Actually, not only the government and the elite, but the Quebec units, just as Julien mentioned, is that the long-serving units in Canada and in Quebec propose their unit to go overseas. I know that my unit, the 6th French, not French, Coast Regiment at the time, or now 6th Field Artillery Regiment, sent a letter to the minister. Okay, we're ready. We have so many soldiers and things like that. And other units did so. But the minister, well, you probably will mention it, but decided to put aside the mobilization plan and created units specially designed to go overseas. And he did that across his own network of people that he knew. So units were created on purpose with people that knew the minister. And French Canadians had very little access to that minister for some reasons. And more to that, since communication hub was mainly around Quebec City because of sea communication, trains, and the minister decided to make the camp in Quebec City, in Valcartier, that was created for that purpose. So that meant that units from the area, the 8th and 9th Battalion, were used to defend the strategic points in Quebec City and around the seaway and support the camp. So people had to resign for their formal unit in order to enroll to the new units, but COs wouldn't let that, because if not, they would not carry on their local defense mission. So you see, it's kind of a mix of different different factors. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to pretend that we're big fans of Sam Hughes here, but
he who shall remain nameless.
The RMR, Royal Montreal Regiment, it's our mission to try and work the RMR into every episode, no matter what we're doing. Like we got them in the battle. Can I? Like
they were there. There was one or two.
The spirit was there.
There was, yeah.
But the RMR wouldn't have existed, because what you're talking about, when the deployment plan was thrown out the window, the mobilization plan, and they just went ahead and did everything they wanted to do with the Sam Hughes way. That's how you got the creation of the RMR. But we were at least, foresighted enough that we brought in a couple of companies of the Académie Royale. So the first French Canadian troops that were fighting together and training together in formed subunits were with the RMR, which we love to
and I think with the only bilingual unit.
Correct.
Right?
We like to remind our Bandu friends that that the first French Canadian formed subunits were the RMR.
Yeah. That was us. It was us.
Well, not us particularly.
Well, not us particularly. Not that old, but yes.
But speaking of poking fun at our good friends of Bandu, this lobbying that you're talking about, because I that's a really interesting concept of how these units that you're talking, these pre-existing units, had already received orders that they had to defend strategic vital points, and then their soldiers want to get into the action, because let's face it, they're young guys and they want to get off to the coolest new thing, and they want to because the war is going to be over by Christmas. Everyone knows that, right?
Try the training.
That's right. So they got to get over there. But then the French Canadian elite, or the French Canadian society, really wanted to make sure that they were represented, and they wanted to have their own French Canadian units, which there was a lobbying effort and led to eventually to the creation of the Royal Vendus Regiment, the famed Vendus.
Yes.
Why and you mentioned the Vendus earlier, Julien, about World War II, and how the concept would have been easier for English Canada. We just kind of fed all the Francophones into the Vendu, and there's enough of it. So why was this unit's creation so important in refuting the idea of reluctance, and why? And maybe explain why they were called the Vendus.
Yeah. So there's a lot to say over there. But as you mentioned, the first contingent, 1st Canadian Division, formed initially, and the 3 Quebec-born battalion, 12, 13, and 14. So the numbers were initiated from 1 to 18 for the first contingent. So the second contingent was in preparation already, and the minister refused to have a French unit in the first contingent, but allowed, after a lot of discussion and pressure, and even the clergy, the Catholic hierarchy supported that, because they wanted a unit where people could speak in French within the organization, and that was the main element. People thought that, yes, they would serve if they can serve their own language, own culture, and religion. So it was after very long discussions that it was accepted. So it was the 22nd battalion that was created and or authorized. And it started its recruitment in the Montreal area and formed in Saint-Jean, Richelieu, because there's different Saint-Jean. So yeah. But the first CO had some political support because he was a gunner first, but he was also the superintendent of the Quebec Arsenal. So Colonel Gaudet gathered political support, clergy support, and got the unit that was created and got its full number of people as soon as December, if I recall correctly, and they were called the Vendus because of sort of a nickname for the pronunciation of Vendu in English. So yes, it's a nickname, but it became part of the culture and a symbol of that French Canadian unit. Kind of a funny reminder that the separation between French and English. We can't pronounce things in English as the English can't pronounce Vendus or Vendu correctly. But as you mentioned, it was a major step, but still there were a lot of Canadians, as you mentioned, in 14th Battalion. And we must talk about one of my relatives, Richard Garon, who was from Beauce and served with the 14th Battalion from the first moment. So, and again, in his service file, there is a report from a doctor, and it says this individual with a very strong foreign accent, blah, 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 blah. So again, we can't escape history.
You can't just escape history. One of my favorite medical files I've ever seen is you're trying to identify black soldiers, and it talked about, because they didn't have race on the intake form for medical, but it was one of the RMRs, and it was complexion, dark, underlined, varied, and then hair, curly, very.
and I must mention again. So we might talk about the population and demography a bit later, but which the French component of 14th Battalion is very important and sometimes totally forgotten. So you have Frank Narcisse Garon, that may recall something to you. He's got the military medal with 2 bars, but he's a French guy from the Gaspé Peninsula with First Nation origin. Wow. He didn't serve with the 22nd Battalion. He was with 14th Battalion.
Yeah. 3 bars. That means he's been awarded. Sorry, 2 bars. It means he's been awarded 3 times for people who were trying to keep score.
Exactly.
Unbelievable. Well, Rejoy, what do you think?
Well, you know what? I think.
Sorry.
No, very, very, very quick note. Actually, I don't want to overstep or anything, but I think one of the reasons we also remember the 22nd contribution as being like the main contribution from the French Canadians is that it was the only French Canadian unit at the time. But I actually not really a discovery because it was well known. It's just like I've just learned about it recently. But around the same time that the 22nd was created, there was also a second French Canadian battalion that was created a little bit after that, which was the 41st Battalion. But that was, I think, disbanded a couple of years, or just like maybe like a couple of months after his foundation because of various logistical reasons and training reasons, stuff like that. So, but it was at the time it was supposed to be like several French battalions, French Canadian battalions to be sent in Europe to fight, but just the 22nd left for reasons that we already explained.
Well, they're probably using them to break them up and feed in reinforcements, right? Would that be, Richard?
Exactly. It's a very good point. The 22nd Battalion was the first that was on the front line, but after that creation, 12 other infantry battalions, French-speaking battalions, were created. And as mentioned by Colin, and as a result of that improvised mobilization plan, instead of having reinforcing companies or support in the back in the country, those battalions on the front didn't have second line support because they were not, old units. So all the others, and it's the same thing with English battalions. So the other battalions kind of mobilized, went to England, and then served as reinforcement because of 22nd or 13 or 14 battalion were wiped out like 3 or 4 times during the war. So actually, then I accounted for up to 26 French-speaking or mostly French-speaking units during the First World War. But we always remember about the 22nd that were on the front. So you mentioned the 41st, but there's only the 57th. There is a French-speaking artillery battery, 57 battery. There is railway troops. There is 2 hospitals, French-speaking hospitals, signal sections, the field companies. And so there were a lot of other units, French-speaking, but we remember only the one.
It's important to bring up the signals so that Sarah and Barry doesn't complain again and get us in trouble. I'm sure that's very, very important for us.
Signals are very important.
Very, very
extremely important.
We love signals.
We love signals. But that, I'm so glad we're talking about this because English Canadians, for the most part, know little enough about the French contribution, both world wars and thereafter as well. But the one name they do know are the Vandus,
Of course.
right? Not aware of the fact that there's so many other French Canadian regiments,
of course,
that were created for this fact, and I love it that we're bringing that to light and people are becoming more aware of it.
You're right, because if you have just a cursory overview of history, if you're an Anglo-Canadian, you might fairly be left with the impression that the best that those French Canadians could do was produce one unit.
One unit, that's right. Not true at all. Not true at all.
But speaking of that,
well, Colin, I think this is a good time to pause for our ever popular fantasy sponsor segment. Gentlemen, please bear with us. And we're very pleased to announce that this episode is unofficially brought to you by Vandus Vodka. Speaking of the Vandus, distilled in Quebec and inspired by the Royal 22nd Regiment of the Royal oh my God, my French has gone really bad, hasn't it?
For you?
Forget the rum. The only unit in the Canadian Army whose goat has a better service record than most sailors.
Vandus Vodka, strong, steady, and proudly Francophone, just like the regiment it honors.
And unlike us, me especially, it doesn't pretend to be bilingual.
Vandus Vodka, even Baptiste knows when to stop at one shot.
Well,
thanks for bearing with us.
Yes,
all the Vandus were complaining. Let's blame Rejoy here.
I will happily take it. So the formation of the Vandus wasn't an automatic grant from the government, though, was it? The government would have been perfectly happy to keep with only English-speaking units. And the minister, who shall not be named, was a big proponent of that, wasn't he? Richard?
Yes. I was taking a pause, thinking about what that vodka would smell like. If it smelled like Betis, I wouldn't take any of it. Anyway, so again, we spoke about the first big push and political struggle that it took to create that first battalion, and then it got momentum and because of the war dynamic, especially. So it wasn't going that well after the second contingent on the ground. Like units were being wiped out. So it was agreed that we must make every effort to mobilize as much people as we can. So again, Colonel Frédéric Mondelet-Godet got that first unit out the door, and the others kind of follow. And I must mention the 189th Battalion, which was created from Bas-Saint-Laurent, Gaspésie. And that battalion assembled people from the rural communities and very dispersed population, because that area is about 600 kilometers distant from point to point.
Wow.
So that's a lot of ground to cover to muster about 700 people. And it was put together by Lieutenant Colonel Pius a gunner again. Sorry, but he was a
Ah,
temporary
you
gunner
have to bring that
serving
in.
We're not the only ones
previously
with the
with.
bias
Yeah,
here, right?
I'm
Yes,
sensing that.
exactly. Yeah, but we're going back after with the gunners. Anyway, but
Don't worry, we'll
he
edit
used to
that
serve
out.
with 80. He was serving previously with 89 Témiscouata and a Whiskey Battalion. So that's the regiment from the area, and those people serve, and as mentioned previously, the people that were deserving in the 22nd Battalion, Joseph Cable, Lieutenant Brillant, which won the Victoria Cross, were all from that area and recruited from that battalion, as well as Frank Narcisse Garon, which were from that battalion. So, and that battalion had a reputation of being the tough Gaspésians. So, yeah, it was a lot of those heroes that now we forgot, but came from rural areas as much as the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. And that's another introduction that I must make. So General Tremblay, which is well known for commanding the 22nd Battalion and later 5 Brigade. But first, he was from Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. And he served with, again, 6th Field Artillery Regiment, another gunner.
Oh, again.
The first unit that Richard
And
came
he
at.
joined in February 1915. He joined the 22nd Battalion as the 2IC. And then in December 1915, he took over from Godet, which was a bit older. So the trench did not agree well with him. And that's Tremblay that made the 22nd Battalion what it is.
Ah, okay. Interesting. And he was a pretty successful businessman first, right?
Yeah, he was a surveyor and had an impact in the wood industry, and was very involved both in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean and in Quebec area.
Right.
Amazing, isn't it?
And Julien, how would you compare that to World War II mobilization?
Well, Richard really makes a great point in emphasizing how the French Canadians' participation in World War I was really more diverse than what we typically assume, and how it goes very far beyond than the Vadou's own participation. But I just want to point out personally that it might be really necessary to make a distinction between participation at the higher level and participation at the lower level. We mentioned numerous times, that all of the regiments were were founded like by rich businessmen, Anglophone, but also Francophones, serve their own personal interest. But I think what these are people that I refer as being at the higher level. So people who had basically the decision that I make is basically people who can make the decision on how they want to use French or how they want to recruit people for their own units.
Yeah.
So these are people that were already educated, already culturally ingrained with the Canadian Army, who were also themselves already fluent in English, and people who I will just purely speculate, probably differ more as Canadians than French Canadians or as Quebecois. I think already you can perceive my UQAM coming out of me as I'm speaking right now. But so yeah, obviously, so this is also, this was a culture that we can see like from the militia in the 19th century, but also during the First World War, but also that carried out all the way to the Second World War. Before this recording, we noted the name of Brigadier Pierre-Edouard Leclerc, which I would admit I didn't know beforehand. But doing a quick research about this person, Leclerc is actually a very perfect example of an individual that represents for me this level of participation. He was a veteran of the First World War. He was a businessman and was able to work within the army to promote the uses of French in his own units. Besides them, there's also Donald Bédard, who was the commander of the Fusilier Montréal during the Second World War, who, I don't know, I haven't checked his tax or anything. I don't know how wealthy he was or anything like that. But I know that before the Second World War, he was an officer for the Fusilier Montréal with the British Army and the Canadian Army for a long time. So he was really somebody who was, as a French Canadian person, really ingrained with this culture, this predominantly British and Anglophone culture, but within that culture, we'll try to change, to change the how could I say, the routine with his own unit. Famously, before it was possible, he would really encourage his soldiers to use French. He will also try to carry his order in French and everything like that. It was pretty mitigated. I don't think I don't think his superiors were really happy with that, but it will still really do. He'll do as much as he could. So this is for the higher level. As for the lower levels, obviously I'm talking about all the lower level of class of soldiers. So like fresh recruits, the grunts, the lower officers and stuff like that. So people who had no possibility of making decision on how to use French or how to recruit or how to carry out their lives in French. So contrary to popular belief, recruitment of French-speaking soldiers in World War II was pretty good. I mean, it was not amazing. It was not blown away. It was not, people were not like going in drove to recruitment office, but it was not that bad. If I can, I mean,
well, that's a ringing endorsement.
it
right
was
there.
okay. It was okay. It was okay. It was okay. Honestly, as historians such Bernier know, that at least something like 20% of Canadian recruits were French-speaking Québécois, with an estimation between 84,000 to 90%, which is honestly, I think for me, it's pretty good. I think some people might disagree with that. I don't know. I see 19,000 volunteers. I think that's okay.
That's not
in my humble estimation. But at the same time, I know I'm doing a parenthesis, but at the same time, there was a lot of soldiers that will be like fighting in France or in Italy in 1943, 1944, will complain about the lack of recruits. They will complain about the lack of quality recruits and stuff like that. So it's really
not just French, English.
That's right, very much so.
Oh, yeah, obviously. So yeah, in the beginning of the war, honestly, like the recruitment rates for the recruitment rates, for the soldiers in the Second World War, kind of like the same pattern as for the First World War, with a massive amount of recruitments in 1914 to 1915, but us steadily declining as the war went on because people learned about what was going on in the war and were not kind of discouraged in participating. We also had the same phenomenon in the Second World War with a good amount of recruitments in 1942. I will say maybe 1941, maybe 1942. But when we will actually start fighting, in Italy in 1943, now the recruitment started to dwindle a little bit. As we know, the Royal Battalion was not the only French-speaking unit that was mobilized in the recruited forces during the Second World War, and many military units were actually involved into active service at the beginning of the war. So we I already mentioned it very quickly, but the Fusée Montréal was one of the first French-speaking units to fight in the war. They were part of the very disastrous Dieppe raid in 1942. Have you guys made an episode on the Dieppe raid? Did I miss it? Oh, you guys did, huh?
No, we've not done one, but it's planned for next time.
Yeah. Well, it's time for it. Yeah, of course.
Keep your calendar free.
Yes, please. Yes.
We're perfect. Okay. I'll take that a note. So yeah, well, they will fight in Dieppe, but also like numerous French-speaking units that will fight in, like I already mentioned, like Italy, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and so on. I'm mostly focused personally about like infantry units. I think this is more like my specialization, but needless to say that also a lot of French-speaking people will also participate in different operations with the Navy, with the Air Force, during the Battle of Atlantic, for example, or during the Blitz.
And the artillery, right, Richard?
And the artillery, of course. Obviously, of course. So basically, what I'm trying to say, and as we keep, I think, hammering all throughout this episode, is that the French Canadian population during World War was extremely broad. So on one hand, you had the higher officers and the private backers who really tried to work within the confines of the Canadian Army to promote a greater use of French amongst their own troops. And on the other hand, you had the participation at the lower level. So the soldiers and the lower officers who they were the volunteers in their own French unit, French-speaking units, and they will carry out their lives in French as best as they could while being shot at. So that's the point.
I love the way you ended that.
Yeah, it's important.
But
I think one of my biggest flaws in terms of my communication is just trying to hand out a perfect note. But I'm glad this one landed. So
it definitely landed. But to your point, what you just mentioned, Julien, about the different French Canadian regiments in the Second World War. One of my favorite little snippets from history is landing on Sword Beach, the Régiment de la Chaudière.
Yes.
And when they came ashore and they were greeted by the villagers in the area, and they were so surprised that the soldiers spoke French, and they were so happy. And there was, the story of the one soldier speaking to a woman in the village saying, she said, "Oh, you speak French?" She said, "Yes, we are French."
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was such a wonderful little story.
Well, we
I
had the
love that.
same thing. I remember episode 8, Into the Trenches.
Into the Trenches, yeah.
There's a couple of companies of the RMR when they're getting those famous goat skins.
Yes, yeah, the wonderful goat skins.
And
yeah.
the locals were
Yes.
amazed to find Canadians, the Britannic, the British, who were speaking speaking French.
But smelled so bad.
Smelled so bad, yeah.
Yes,
Well, that was
that had to do with the goat skins, yes.
So, Richard, I mean, I know your particular focus has been really on helping dispel the myth that there was minimal participation from French Canadians, and there's maybe some numbers say like 35,000 volunteers. But even if we accept the conservative traditional estimate of nearly 15,000 volunteers, what did their experience look like if they weren't lucky enough to land in the Vendus, like a French-speaking regiment, or even the RMR that still had like French companies at certain point? But to be fair, the French-Canadian company in the RMR was absorbed into the English ones as all the other reinforcements came through. So probably after 1916 into 17, there wasn't a lot of French.
Yeah, they're just eaten up in the machine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what it would have been like for your typical French-Canadian who ended up in an English unit, Richard?
Well, I'll come back later about the number of French Canadians serving because my estimate goes up to 65,000 at least. It could be even higher. But again, it depends from the beginning to the end of the war. There is a difference. If you were a French speaking soldier in, let's say, the RMR, the experience was different than if you were with, let's say, the 9th Battalion, because with my research, I revealed, but it was already known, but people forgot. But half the French-speaking people were outside of Quebec.
Oh,
so
yes.
most of those people serve with English-speaking units.
Right.
So that experience would vary if you're with a unit that you cannot practice your religion, or if you're alone within a lot of English speaker that was freshly arrived from Europe. So that experience varied a lot. So I'll take a few examples. So again, one of my other ancestor or relative, Marie Martin Lefrançois Garon, was a captain with the 89 Témiscouata and Rimouski Regiment back in Rimouski before the war. So with the war, he enrolled. He was attached to the Royal Canadian Regiment, which was considered an Atlantic area regiment. So there were part of French in that regiment, and serving would be okay, meaning that we have other people speaking French, relatively the same culture, and you could practice probably your religion. But later in the war, he was attached as a liaison officer with the Royal Canadian Dragoons, which was totally the inverse. So it was English speaking, no Catholic, nothing there. So the experience would be like very, very different in that unit. So again, pardon me?
It would be like
night and day. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So that experience would vary. And you have other people, again, just from 1911 to 1914, about 250,000 French speakers from Quebec moved to the west into Saskatchewan, Manitoba, recently created. So they were looking for land and probably becoming rich and things like that. So you have people that that were speaking French, not a lot of English, but they were with, as mentioned, in other battalions. Let's say the 22nd Battalion, just as Private Elodie Bruno, who enrolled from Saint-Pierre, Manitoba. Again, there would be some French speaker in that community. But other, let's say you were the second or third generation French in an area, as Private Irving. Notice there that the difference in the surname. Irving is an English name. So Irving Bellard from Pembroke, Ontario. His parents were French, but He served in an English. Sorry, my accent is very bad today. Anyway, so serving in an English battalion, but again, he was probably fluent bilingual and had no issue with that. And you had other people that, in order to be integrated, changed their name from Desjardins to Desjardins or
Oh, yeah.
Dubois,
Easier to
Wood.
pronounce in
There's
English. Yeah,
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 exactly.
that makes a lot
And
of
other
sense.
people had a really different experience, such as Lieutenant Joseph Arthur Robert Côté, my favorite. He's from Charny, close to Lévis. It's 95% French speaker still today, but he served with 46 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. So he had to learn English from scratch, and his life
Wow.
must have been with the British, very difficult.
Yeah.
I can well imagine that. Well, the
Yeah,
English
that's
the British are always very good with pronouncing foreign names, right? Especially the French. I mean, Ypres became wipers simply because, like there's a Y and there's a P. How does that work?
Exactly.
So,
All right. So where were we?
it varied. Yeah.
Yeah, you telling something about the percentages as well as because you mentioned earlier in the episode about that huge influx of immigration we had, about 1.5 million coming right before Canada. So I think it's something that's overlooked when we're getting our elbows up and we're talking about how amazingly Canadian we are. That the vast majority of recruits who were going to the colors in 1914 were not actually born in Canada. They were British born.
That's right,
But you
British
said
born.
so for actual Canadians who were born in Canada, French Canadians volunteered at a disproportionately higher rate. Is that true? Is that accurate?
Yeah. That's what I found. As mentioned, I'm a political scientist, so we have a different approach. So I started by questioning, participation in that myth of French speaker that did not really like participating into the First World War. So I posed the hypothesis that in order to confirm or infirm that statement, that the percentage of French speakers within the Canadian Expeditionary Force would be similar to the French speaker in the general population. So I started with that. So as I looked into that period, so I found out about that immigration, but there were other movements, as I already mentioned, 250,000 people from Quebec to the Western provinces, but also, I don't know if you knew that, but there were a lot of French speakers from 1850 to 1905 that moved to the United States, and some villages and towns were basically French speaking within Massachusetts and Maine and things like that. So during that same period, 1905, 1911, 184, 60, 65 French speaker moved to the United States.
Wow.
So there were about 700,000 French speakers in the United States before the First World War. And in the same time, 750 people came from the state, and those numbers could not discriminate who's French speaker or other, but 750 people came from the state to the Western provinces. So, there's a lot of movement there where a lot of people were not not where they were supposed to be, or, skip the balance on French speakers and the population. So on my hypothesis, it roughly came to French speakers in Canada should be about 28% of the Canadian born population. And I had to separate which of the population were born in Canada and not. So we know, and it's always about being known, that the Canadian Expeditionary Force was largely, initially, composed of people from other countries, but they migrated to Canada.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what I did, I took samples from different areas and different periods of the war. So just to make sure that I had the proportion correctly. So the Canadian-born were supposed to be 65% of the general population in Canada. So I was expecting to have 65% within the Canadian Expeditionary Force. I'm gonna have to stop saying that word. So
Say CEF, buddy.
okay, CF. Sorry. So I took the Battle of Ypres in 1950. So there were 119 dead. It's easier to count the dead than the people actually within the battle because there were so many. So I took the dead. I went through the military service records and things like that, and I found out that there were only 28% of Canadian-born among those ones. That's interesting.
Wow.
Now the Francophones, we're expecting 28%. 26 of them died among the 190. So it's roughly 22%. Okay, it's not that quite, but it's higher than we're supposed to be let know, because apparently some researchers said there were only 5% of French speaker in the first contingent. So hey, maybe they're dying in greater number. I don't know, but statistically it should be correct. So after that, I took the volunteers from Quebec, which were supposed to be 28%, but that's a different 28%. 28% is for the French speaker, because they are English speaker in Quebec, but it's a coincidence that it's 28%. So we are about 23%. Okay, it's a bit lower than we're expecting, but again, there are some elements that may explain that, because people serve in the regional units. So if that unit was in the fight, so maybe it's not the same numbers and things like that. So what it came to me, and I had a control group with the Ontario and Prince Edward Island, so 34% and 41%. And Prince Edward Island was 1%, and it came to 0.6. So what I did, because it's only one instance during the war, so I did samples from different battles and dates until 1917, because of conscription that would change the numbers. So I came up at the end, only 39% of Canadian-born participated in the CEF. Francophones were 28.08%. It's pretty good.
Pretty good.
And
That's incredible,
Quebecers were 22%. Ontario was 33%, so it's a bit lower than we were expecting. And Prince Edward Islands were 0.85. So in the end, 1915, 1917, numbers are not that bad. And we see a decrease of British-born or foreign-born soldiers as we go through the war, because they were, the first to volunteer right out of the bat. But in the end, Canadian-born people came and answered the call.
Well, Richard,
So that's roughly numbers. But I know numbers are a bit boring, but that's it.
No. I mean, that sheds a lot of light on the subject. And, we were also talking about how you got this influx of people, Anglophones, into the army. French Canadians are also volunteering, coming into the army. And just on the note of your numbers, Richard, Newton it disputes them all. So you'll be getting an email from him. But I'm just wondering, as French Canadians are now volunteering, getting into the regiments, the language of instruction is still primarily English. Now, for a young Francophone joining up, wants to get into the action, he's being trained by English drill instructors. That must have been a huge hurdle.
Yes, but that's why you have French-speaking units so that the drill instructor now would be speaking in French. Yeah, it's not official, but it would speak in French. And in the end, it would help. But it's after that, that's the Irish law, as mentioned by Julien, where you had nothing above unit level so that French people could serve in staff, brigade and divisional level. But again, they would struggle, or even people would, just as the Vanier was a 2SC in the 22nd Battalion. Well, he had a wonderful pen writing the war diary in English for the 22nd Battalion. But as you know, he rose through the ranks and became Governor General.
Yes.
Yeah, you got to think though, just the burden on the officers and NCOs. You mentioned, sure, they were giving unofficially the words of command and training in French, but that means that there's a burden on them to do, like you just mentioned, like Van, you having to translate. And it just dawned on me that you think of World War I, the gas warfare. So when you would rotate your troops back from the line and they had to go to a gas school, well, if your unit was going through, there were dedicated instructors at the gas school because they were rotating units so quickly.
Yeah.
But if the Vendu show up, they would have to, the Vendu NCOs wouldn't be getting a break. They would have to learn how to give that instruction so they could teach their soldiers and take their soldiers through it. Whereas if, I don't know, the Black Watch or the Queen's Own shows up, their NCOs are just going through the training like everyone else. They're following the directions as opposed to, so like the burden is extra. The NCOs and the officers are working not double, but they're working substantially more than what an English unit would have to be doing.
Yeah, that's a great point.
They still do.
They still do. Yeah, you're
yes.
absolutely right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that's absolutely correct, isn't it? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we had a good example of an RMR. Hercule Barré was one of the first company commanders, and then went on to command the 65e Carabiniers Montréal. But he was he was arrested like twice trying to go to headquarters to get orders because he's coming in at night, and when the sentry would stop him, he would respond, but he had an accent, and so they were convinced he was a spy, and they shot him once.
Oh my God!
Hercule Barré got shot going to. Luckily, just grazed in a slight wounding, but still
Good to see security was tight.
Yeah.
Was he shot at
obviously things were much better by 1939.
Was he shot after like his first attempt or second attempt?
And much better.
Oh,
we had a pause there.
Did we?
I think we're all back.
We're back. I think we're back.
Yeah,
Yes,
I think you guys are back.
Did you hear the question, Julia? It was I was making a comment that I'm presuming by the Second World War that all these systemic issues have been fixed. Were they all managed better?
Well, I'm really bad at math, so I'm not gonna go into like the numbers and everything. My simple is like 19%, so it's really far below the Richard's number. But yeah, like the problem with one-way bilingualism meant that Francophone, like we already talked about earlier, like if they had to learn English to advance. So while the army was more willing to create French Canadian units, this was already not the case for the Navy and the Air Force, but like the French Canadian recruits really had to learn the business in English if they want to be, if they want to be pilots or if they want to be like NCOs or whatever. In fact, actually, we have a great quote here. In fact, Lieutenant General Guy Simons, who was the chief of the General Staff, who famously stated that it is not economically possible to have Francophone units in the Royal Canadian Navy, which really reinforced the English-only character. Actually,
not to correct you anymore, but I doubt very much that Lieutenant General Simons ever referred to himself as Guy. Pretty sure that was
Guy Simons. Guy Simons.
Which may have been part of the problem.
Which actually just reminded me, like a couple of months ago, my dad. Well, I think it's really this small idea is really representative of how like Quebec's ambivalence towards its own military history. My dad. Obviously knows my job, what I'm doing, what I'm studying. Every week he's gonna send me like some fun facts about the war, stuff like that. But it just very recently that it occurred to him that one of his great uncle was part of the Navy during the Second World War, and he's just like, oh yeah, that happened. He told me about that. I'm gonna send you some pictures. I'm gonna send you stuff over that. But so it just occurred to me, like, yeah, this guy, if he wanted to join the Navy as a French Canadian, he had to learn English necessarily. So I'm really anyway. I'll have to research about that. But yeah, just as a side note. In preparation for this recording, I read historian Yves Tremblay's book, Volontaires des Québécois en guerre, which I really recommend. It's a very great book to just have a big understanding of like our own participation, our own being a French Canadian participation during the Second World War. And as I already mentioned, I have just a sample of 19 persons, which he covers in his books. In his book, and what he pointed out is that 11 out of these people, 11 of the soldiers that he talked to were already bilingual before joining the army. So they already knew English before joining the army. Out of the rest, so like the 8 remaining persons, 2 of them actually faced professional consequences for not speaking English while being in, infantry units.
Wow.
One of them is kind of dubious. Like, he explains that his lack of English was probably a made-up reason to just kick him out of his position because, like, according to him, like his direct officer just didn't really like him for some reason, so he just used his lack of English.
We're all victims.
It is 2025, so yes.
It is. So yeah, basically, he thinks he might have just having like a reason to just like kick him out of his position, but it's not really clear. The other one is more explicit. As he explained, he started service with the Royal Canadian Dragoons as a lieutenant, but was eventually transferred to the unit first to the infantry. First with the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry, but after that with the Régiment Maisonneuve due to his lack of English skills, which was seen as a weakness amongst his peers. Like if he was to be in the battlefield and to talk with his English comrades, it might have been like complicated for him. So this was for the lower soldiers and the lower officers. But what about the higher grades, the higher officers? We talk a little bit about Brigadier Leclerc, how he tried to promote the uses of French among his troops. So Leclerc was first appointed as the commander of the 5th Infantry Brigade in the 2nd Canadian Division with the intention of making a fully functional French-speaking unit, all with Canada's Ottawa's approval. Everybody seemed to be very fine with the idea of just having a full-on French-speaking brigade among the Canadian Army. But that didn't last for very long. So what happened is that very, very soon, they will like set up the units. They will say, okay, like, this unit will be part of this brigade and so on and so forth. And what happened is that the Fusiliers Mont-Royal, which was supposed to be part of the brigade, were stuck in Iceland, of all places. So they temporarily put the Calgary Islanders as part of the brigade, just as a temporary measure, just for the training.
Good call that. Calgary Islanders.
Yeah, but like, but like what happened is that one Major General, Victor Adlom, saw the Calgary Islanders working with the French. It was like, this is so cool. This is such like the big Canadian dreams of like, I'm just going to read this quote because I think it's super funny, but like this plan will give French and English speaking Canadians wider contacts. Men from the prairie will be working daily with French speaking Canadians from Quebec. The result will be a contribution of great national value to the future life of the Dominion. So basically just a Canadian wedgery of having the French and the English soldiers working side by side. Yeah. So what was supposed to be
beautiful.
So what was supposed to be just like a temporary measure just became the norm for the brigade. And very soon after, Leclerc was discharged because of health reasons. Apparently he was overweight, so that's why they sent him back to Canada. So I don't know if that's true. I haven't seen pictures of him.
Well, we did an episode on Battle of the Bulge. Maybe that was a problem. Clearly, he lost that battle.
Clearly, he was sent home.
So when Leclerc left, it kind of provoked some worries with the general staff regarding the perception of firing pretty much the only Francophone officers at that level. I mean, so the Defense Minister, Gilles Ralston, what he said was that his removal will, of course, be used by those who allege that French Canadians being supplanted by English-speaking officers, which kind of happened when his position was given to a certain Lieutenant Colonel G.V. Whitehead from the Royal Montreal Regiment.
Wow, good guy all around, we'd like to say.
You guys know him, right?
In fact. Not personally, obviously, but...
In fact, he's going to be there for the next episode, I believe, right?
Well, possibly, yes.
We're trying to book him.
His spirit, yeah.
Honestly, I'm like I'm a really skeptical and cynical person by nature. When I see just like a French Canadian person just being booed for an English one, I kind of like, all right, really? It was really for
He
his
was a
competence, right?
Quebecer, though. Come on, Julien. Whitehead was Quebecer.
He was not a Calgary
That's right.
Highlander.
That's right.
He's from
That's right.
Westmount, that bastion of French Canadians. And his family was probably one of the lead donors of building the armory in terms of cash. And his mother
But, you know-
donated first stand of colors to the regiment. So,
But we'll just
Oh,
sort of gloss over that a little
yeah,
bit. So
yeah.
I didn't know that.
But he was a Quebecer. He was a Quebecer.
No, you're right. It was a Quebecer all the same. But honestly, like I said, I'm a really skeptical person by nature. But like what it seems like is that also, it was really true that they didn't have any other person, French-speaking person, to just replace Leclerc. By the time the war started, the Canadian Army was just really severely lacking in terms of like officers, in terms of soldiers, in terms, pretty much in terms of everything. I'm quoting here historian C.B. Stacy, who noted that General MacNaughton cabled that, again, open quotation, the possibility of replacement by French-speaking Canadian officer has been thoroughly explored, but there are none in the Canadian Army overseas who have the required qualification. Honestly, everything that I've read tends to veer towards that direction, and very sincerely so. This was true for the Anglophone majority. Like the problem of just having a lack of officer was not true simply for the French one, but also for the Anglophones one. I mentioned very quickly about the what was his name, Victor Hudlum, who was really into the idea of like a bilingual French Canadian army, but Hudlum was also vastly incompetent. It was just it was one of those. I think if I recall correctly, I think it was one of those guys.
Charming. I'm very charming.
But like, if I recall correctly, I think it was one of those guys who was like summoned for experience during the First World War, who had some experience with the army, was discharged after the war ended. When the Second World War started, I mean, he volunteered as like, oh, I'll put my hat on the pile. But it was like much more like preoccupied about like the uniforms of his troops and like their parades and the ceremony, and just actually training them for the war. He was very old school and was really inadequate for his job. But also, like reading Yves Tremblay's book and reading the testimonials of the 19 soldiers who participated in the war, a lot of them will just complain about, well, I think that's very typical for every soldier. So I don't think they're just going to be the only ones, but they will complain about their officers. They will complain about their training. They will complain about every level of people above them. So, like I said, I think it's very typical for any soldiers mobilized. I think everybody's going to complain about the superiors, not just soldiers, but also everybody in the workforce. But I think it was just much more true at the time for them. So, but like regardless of everything, I don't think it really changed the fact that despite this complication, like French Canadians at every level were really willing and motivated recruits when the war started. So I think that's the little silver lining of all the situation, at least.
That's the key message.
And I think complaining and grousing is a soldier's right.
Well,
I do it all the time. Very particular.
You're an expert.
Yes, I do.
Subject matter
Never
expert.
let me. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, in essence, French Canadians were certainly willing to join. I mean, they wanted to join, they wanted to fight, but they had to compromise their language, cultural identity, and religion as well.
Yeah.
You know, in many cases, just simply to be a part of the process. And wouldn't you say that also constantly fueled some of the tensions going on back home in Quebec among those communities? Either of you guys?
Yeah. I'll take it first. Because my answer is, as a political scientist, is yes and no, always. So there is part of yes, but in fact, when we look at the public opinion, 1916, 1917, you know, when the cables come back and report on the battles, the public opinion towards French Canadians are very favorable. And it's only later that, you know, their reputation turns around, and it's around the debate for conscription. So initially, French Canadians, even in the English speaking papers, are very well seen as great soldiers and real fighters on the battleground. But as the conscription became a political debate, then the issue became also based on partisanship. So Julien already mentioned it. When the battle and the reports on the number of dead, became relevant and told the atrocities of war, well, people said, "Look, we're not really willing to send our sons into the battle." So, and maybe it's the success of 14th Battalion and 22nd Battalion, but also the number of dead relating to that. But Quebec opinion, but not only the French Canadian, but in Quebec, the opinion became towards against conscription. But now the issue for the political dynamics became that to oppose the conscription vision of Quebec's vision of conscription, then some political parties and individuals, kind of use the ethnic and the language card. Never see that today to gain on political aspects. So yeah, and another aspect that that became part of the myth is that now the after the war there was a lot of theater books and that became movies and things like that glorified desertion within Quebec and the resistance to to conscription. But that it was not only in Quebec. The resistance was throughout the country, and there is as much deserter stories in Alberta than in Quebec. But for some reasons, it became so. But the other issue there, and we might talk a bit later about it, is that people became annoyed with the frustration and maybe perception that some people did not do their share, but not people that were in the community and not serving, but people in uniform. So let's take it as an example. There were 425,000 soldiers on the front line from the CEF, on the front line. But there were 628,000 people serving in uniform. So what the other 200,000 were doing, instead of going to the front, they were recruiting new people within the street. And that's frustration. And the idea that some people were using their position as recruiter or as people within Canada to send other people to the front in their name was, one reason for the social tension.
Right. Now, you're talking about the front line and, that kind of reluctance and the people, there's a perception that there was the reluctance, but we know that's not true. Can you talk a little bit more about the Vandus? And they were the sole French-speaking infantry battalion in First World War. What was their combat experience like? What was it like for them in the trenches, and where were they fighting?
Oh, that's a very good question. And as mentioned, I'm not really a historian, but I do heard, heard a bit of stories. And the thing would be not different from others, because the Canadians in general, even the foreign-born Canadians, were renowned for their practical approach to combat. So if there was a problem, they would, design a solution. So there were many challenges, and one of the thing that became an element distinction for 4th Division, which had some French troops and 5 Brigade, was trench warfare, but night warfare. So they would build raids and trench fighting, just as street fighting probably, because there were a lot of fighting in Canada before the war. When there were tension between the ethnic groups or a strike against a company so and so, there would be fighting. So fighting in a trench became something very Canadian identified, and so many other things. So it became, at the end of the war, another national element, nationalistic in the way of a French speaker or nationality. There was an hypothesis or a suggestion that French troops, French-speaking troops, were used as cannon fodder,
Yes.
so that they would send them to be slaughtered and things like that. But in the end, all troops were like that, and Canadians were
Very common
no
perception.
no
yeah.
exception. Yeah, exactly. So, but since they were willing to fight and they were really good fighters, well, yes, they were sent into very difficult positions in Vimy, in Amiens, and even you should do a special episode on Ypres, where 13 and 14 battalion were in the midst and the strongest point of the battle. And it's not only French speakers, but it's Canadian troops
That
that
really
hold
hurts.
the line.
That hurts that you have not listened to episode 8 and 9,
Yes.
which were into the trenches.
And I missed those ones.
And I think we also did another. I think we done about 3 episodes on Ypres, but
Wow. Okay.
that hurts. That hurts, Richard.
I missed those ones.
I'm gonna probably
Sorry.
cry to sleep tonight.
No.
Hey,
Artillery.
You're now at 32 episodes. I can't follow on that. Anyway, so
It's a gunner's perspective. We understand.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Gunners.
there you go. Excellent. But another dimension that I should mention. Some historians use one perspective to say that French Canadians were reluctant to service because of the number of court-martial within 22nd Battalion, which were higher than the rest of the CEF. But another perspective may have been proposed so that willingly Tremblay was harder on his troops because he wanted to show that they were better soldiers and they were more strict than the British troops. So that explains that level of court martials. So different explanations depending on the perspective and what is the point you want to make.
Right.
Yeah, I agree very strongly with that. I mean, at the end of it all, the Vandus forged a fearsome reputation in that war. Julien, turning to World War II, the contributions broadened, didn't they? What about service beyond the infantry? How did French Canadians expand their contribution?
Well, French Canadians already know the all branches of the army, even if they had to function in their second language. So, but really, where they really had to shine through was with the infantry and the armored units. But I think it's really mostly because through working with French-speaking units, they had more chances to just better transmit their own history and their own experience outside of the military, comparison with the Navy and the Air Force. I'll also I'll be very, very candid, and maybe you can cut that to save my reputation. I'm really not as knowledgeable about the Navy or the Air Force. Actually, we okay, great. Because frankly, and just as a small anecdote, we talk about honorary bravery very well at the beginning of the episode, and we just had this critique from one of our back here who said something like, "Well, you guys should really make more contents about the Air Force and the Navy." And we are
looking into that. Yes,
yeah. All of us are kind of like looking at it sideways and like, yeah, he's right. We're really very infantry focused. But yeah, so I'm sorry. I know, Rejoy, your question was about the Navy and the Air Force, but I'm going to veer back to the infantry because honestly, it's where I'm the most comfortable here. And feel free, if any listener wants to send me angry letters, just feel free to do so. I'll be happy to not read them and just like throw them in the trash.
Well, you might get one from Newton. Just
well, we haven't heard him for a while, so I was expecting maybe to
please don't jinx the moment.
Okay, I'll just keep the momentum there. So yeah, well, French Canadians serve in the Francophones units, but all of them also serve in like bilingual unit, such as the case with the Royal Rifles of Canada, which was nominally English speaking. was based around Quebec City, will have most of their recruits in Quebec City, but also I think in the Région of Chaudière-Appalaches and in Gaspésie as well. And a large number of their soldiers were actually, like I said, were very quite bilingual, but also, and we estimate something that at least 30 to 35% of them were French Canadians who either already knew English before joining the army, or just pick up English just by working with English speaking soldiers. I don't recall what's his name, but I think one of them mentioned in this testimonial that I've read somewhere that the first words that he learned was swear words. He will just sit down at the cafeteria with his comrades, and they will say, "All right, French guy, here's all the swear words we can teach you in an hour. Let's go through all of them."
That's the critical
Yeah.
communications,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And the Royal Rifles, the Royal Rifles of Canada, that that we had, that was a unit that saw the
Yes.
devastating
Yes.
Battle of Hong Kong, which we
Also
had
covered.
in episode 14 in our back catalog. And
Yeah.
in a subsequent episode, I know we're going to invite you back there, Julien. You're going to be talking to us more about the role the French Canadians played in that battle and other
Yes.
ones in World War II. But
Yes.
before we get much
Yeah.
further,
Well, hey, we have to go to our fantasy sponsor segment again. And this episode is also unofficially brought to you by Je me souviens gin, handcrafted in Quebec and infused with enough history to make you suddenly start explaining Confederation to total strangers.
smooth, proud, and guaranteed to remind you of something important, even if you can't quite remember what that something was.
Well, that's just the gin talking.
That's just a gin talking. Je me souviens gin, the only drink that remembers, even when you don't.
So let's talk a little about the conscription crisis. Yes, that's always a hot topic. Now, French Canadians volunteered in such high numbers and fought so bravely. Why did this image of reluctance become the dominant narrative, especially for World War I? Richard?
It's a thesis in itself. And I already kind of touch a bit already, and it became a political issue, but societal issue also. And for some reason, but some of the hypotheses that were studied is that as a reaction to First World War, culture that developed afterward, as I mentioned, theater, cinema, books, all show the atrocities of the war. So in a negative way. So it became negative to think about war and service, and indirectly, if you add the language and cultural and religious dimensions, then there's a lot of negativity in that. And one of the main, as an example, maybe you have not seen it, but there was a French series very popular in I think it's in the 80s, Les Ploufs, which is a typical French-speaking family. And when I think it's Ovid, or one of the sons, he comes one day and he's in uniform, and he said, "Hey, Daddy, I just enrolled. I'm going to send grenades in Europe," because he was a baseball pitcher. Anyway, and then the father makes a crisis, and he rests paralyzed for the rest of the series. So that's the image that became impregnated into the cultural aspect and general population, that service war is negative. But individually, and I looked at it until recently, 10 years ago, the recruitment numbers proportionally were higher in Quebec, and especially in Quebec City, than, let's say, in Toronto. Yes, there are more population, but proportionally speaking, service is still something today that is done by French speakers, and yeah, so there is that different approach between the popular view and the individual approach to service. So the conscription was something political, and a situation that was created for a political reason, and a dimension that created permanent damage into the Confederation and the relationship between French and English-speaking Canadians. But still, it's a creation that answered a political need at the time.
Now there was
If
And there
some
are things
violence
that
came out of
support
right?
those myths. Yeah.
There was some serious political, violent and civil unrest. Was there not? Was there not a famous riot in Quebec City?
Yes, indeed. But again, in the popular culture, it is remembered as 8 innocent individual that were shot down by the English-speaking troops that came from Ontario. But the commander of those troops, or General Lessard, a French-speaking officer that rose to the ranks again. That served and things like that. But when you look at the actual reason for that demonstration and popular gathering was to denounce the patronage and again the relationship between the people in uniform that were using their position not to go overseas but to recruit new people and send them overseas. So those dimensions, mix with the resentment. Again, you spoke about the situation outside of Quebec on French language in schools and things like that. So if you add those things and you build a nationalistic narrative around French language and culture, then you can say, yeah, it supports this element of anti-English and anti-participation and anti-conscription. But there are more to it, and it's more complex than the actual thing. And there were riots in other cities in Canada. Yeah, exactly. In 1919, the Winnipeg riot caused more damage than the Quebec City one.
Yeah, and that's not something you see in the popular narrative. Like your average Canadian, when they get their 2 seconds of history in high school, all they heard about the conscription crisis was it was basically isolated in Quebec.
In Quebec, it's all about Quebec.
Want to go over,
Yep, that's right.
But we know that there was riots right across the country. It wasn't just there. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Memory is so complex, isn't it? And it carries over. And we're going to be talking about the Hong Kong episode and with Julien and the Quebec volunteers that were there. But that's what it brings me to an interesting point. Julien, why is it that everybody remembers Dieppe, the Dieppe raid, but nobody talks about Quebecers in Hong Kong? And that was a brutal battle.
Right. Well, I don't want to ignore your question, Rejoy. I just want to jump in quickly to what Richard said very quickly, and then I'll answer your question. Don't worry. But I think, like, essentially what we can summarize with the conscription crisis is that the opposition about Québécois was less about an opposition to the war and more an opposition to the conscription, more an opposition to being forced and participating in the war. Because I feel like before that, and I said a war, but also into the first one and the second war, because I feel before that, there was sort of like this ambivalence towards the Quebec populations towards the war. Kind of an ambivalence in terms of, like, I don't know why we're in it, but I guess we're in it. If you guys want to participate in it, just participate in it, but just don't involve me. I got a field to work on. I gotta go to church. I gotta go.
It's going to follow you in December when you go to visit Julien.
That's right. Exactly.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, no, like I said, I think it was more like like I said, an opposition to the conscription, on the idea of being forced in participating in this war that they were not really that interested in. But anyway, I'm gonna answer a question, Rejoy. I think, well, last year I published an article with the journal, the Canadian Studies, I think that's the name in English, where, to put it very, very simply, if you guys want to read it, you can read it. It's free on the internet. There's no paywall or anything. It's on my LinkedIn, if you guys want to check out my LinkedIn. So I believe that from the moment the Battle of Hong Kong was reported in Quebec French media, it was never really presented as a battle that actually involved troops from the province, unlike what happened when the Dieppe raid was reported. when I've read newspaper from like January 1942, when the defeat at Hong Kong was widely reported, it was really quickly presented as a loss from the British government, which also by extension involved the Canadian federal government, but less as a loss for like Quebec personally. They will report obviously that Royal Rifles of Canada was from Quebec, but it will just pinpoint it as being like, yeah, it's just a unit from Quebec, but like an English-speaking unit, like whatever.
Yeah.
In comparison, when that happened with Dieppe, they were very, very quick to just jump on the idea of like Dieppe was a French Canadian losses because of what happened with the Fusil Royal. So I think this was the first step on like why the memory of Dieppe sticked with Quebec afterwards. There's like 80 years that happened between the first reports in the newspapers to today. But I think this was really the first step in like how the battle was presented. Basically, Dieppe was presented as a French Canadian loss, while Hong Kong wasn't right from the very beginning.
So that's why you kind of think, I presume, that why Dieppe stuck in the memory, but Hong Kong didn't?
Well, I'm still wondering why. Because honestly, at first glance, frankly, the two battles were very, very similar in their premise. I remember when I did, like, for GMSV, I did an exhibit for Hong Kong and did another exhibit for Dieppe. And when I was working on the exhibit for Dieppe, I told my boss, Marina, I said something to her, like, I feel like structurally, like they're very similar. I'm afraid to just like repeat the same premise that what I did in Hong Kong for Dieppe, because I don't know. I said in terms of just premise, not in terms of content or like whatever. But you know, both Hong Kong and Dieppe started by the Canadian Army being roped in a very bigger operation than what they anticipated as, just by directly assisting the British Army. Both of these operations ended also as complete tragedy for like different factors and different multiple reasons and stuff like that. Hong Kong, at its conclusion, you guys already made an episode on this, so I'm just going to dwell on it further, but Hong Kong had a loss of 100% of its effective, and Dieppe was around 75%, with some regiment reaching the casualty rates of 96 and 94%. So absolutely devastating battles on both hands. But what I think happened, besides of this general premise, is that how those tragedies were told. So with Dieppe, there are two elements that really influenced Quebec perception towards its own participation in the Second World War that Hong Kong doesn't have. So the first is that the French Canadian losses at Dieppe were completely avoidable. I'm not going to say too much about it because we might do an entire episode about it, but to put it very simply, the French Canadian participation in Dieppe happened due to a very avoidable mistake. The premise was it like the French Canadian part of the Fusil Royal was part of the second wave to land on the beach, but the first wave were already being completely massacred by the Germans. The battle was already lost by the time the French Canadian arrived. So when they arrived, they got there due to a miscommunication. For some reason that is still very unclear to this day, it was reported that the beach was captured, that it was safe to land. It wasn't. The French Canadian landed. They got also completely massacred, very unfortunately so, but also very avoidably so. So this element of mistake, this element of tragedy was not present in the Battle of Hong Kong. The French Canadians that were in Hong Kong, well, just like the soldiers in general that were in Hong Kong, were not tricked, to put in quotation. They were just part of a battle that was not as well prepared as it should have been, but just like a losing battle, not a battle that was avoidable, just a battle that was not well prepared. The second element is that there's a certain vision that was created about French Canadian after the war. Richard already talked about this with the creation of like, theaters and like TV series and like novels and stuff like that. This idea of like the French Canadian both being manipulated into being a volunteer, but also being resistant to also being a volunteer. Like honestly, this kind of vision of like the Canadian soldier was willing participant to the war, who was marginalized within the Canadian Army, but was also very resistant about it. We can talk about this. Well, this episode is already like 2 hours long, so I don't know how much we're going to talk about this
We're going to wrap up.
in depth. But basically, this is a vision that was really persistent after the Second World War. I think it really came personally because of what happened with the events of the First World War, because of our Canadian participation. But I think Dieppe also became like a reminder of the condition of the First World War. Richard already mentioned with the trench warfare being partially devastating and just being general meat grinders for soldiers, just very battles that were pretty much pointless and high casualty rates. I think Dieppe, by its essence, by being a tragedy, by being also avoidable, kind of reminded people that war was kind of like that. Well, this idea that war was like that, which wasn't really the case, but that's besides the point. So I think, yeah, Dieppe really resonated with this vision of the poor French Canadian who got sent to his death somewhere in Europe, to a case that Hong Kong doesn't have these elements. For the obvious reason that Hong Kong was not in Europe, it was in Asia. So like already
Yes.
there's a clash
Yeah.
right there. But
Yeah.
also that the French Canadians were part of the RRC, but also by extent,
Yeah.
French Canadians were part of the RRC, but part of the Canadian Army in general. They, just stating the obvious, but they were volunteers, and they were volunteers for a reason. A lot of them had a genuine deep patriotism towards Canada, or towards France, or towards the British Crown itself.
Yeah.
So I think this patriotism, well, not all French Canadians were necessarily enrolled because of patriotism, a lot enrolled for other reasons, but a lot of them did so for this reason. And I think this reason really clashed with this vision of the poor French Canadian soldier who was roped into the war that he didn't really want it to be in. And I think that's why, in summary, I think that's why like Dieppe really resonated more with French Canadian than Hong Kong. That Hong Kong just didn't really.
Yeah, it didn't register. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Some far off place, something part of a bigger group. I guess the memory narrative is really quite complicated in that sense, right? I mean, they celebrated the political resistance to the war in terms of conscription. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I'll volunteer, but I don't want to be pulled into it without my own not of my own accord. But on the other hand, you're also there's a focus on heroic sacrifice when it fits the mold of the French Canadian soldier being manipulated by the English Canadian establishment. So say Dieppe, for example, and that leaves what happened in Hong Kong and those volunteers a little bit isolated, doesn't it?
No, exactly. And I think that was the point of like this paper that I published. And I think what happened basically is sort of like in the, like in French we would say like being stuck between like l'arbre et l'écosse. I don't know what would be the translation in English. Between stuck in a hard and a rock place or something like that. I don't know.
Rock in a hard place.
Yeah. Where basically what happened is that the French Canadian soldiers, after the war, when they wanted to talk about the war, when they want to reminisce about these events and deal with their own traumas, they will do so with their own comrades. And so they will do so in space that were typically English leading. So with the soldiers from the Battle of Hong Kong, they will reunite this within themselves with their raw rifles, but also with their comrades from the Weeping Grenadiers. So they will do so in a very typical English space where everybody will just talk to them and it just speaks in English. So we're talking about the Hong Kong Veterans Association, which still exists to this day. I think it just changed the name for the Commemorative Association, which was predominantly Anglophone. There's also other veteran space that were also used by the veterans, but also basically what I'm trying to say is that English was just like the common language for everybody to just properly communicate with them, which I think what happened, like, and that's the double-edged sword, is that yes, they were able to talk about the trauma, to deal with them, but also when it was time to communicate about them to a wider audience, they will still do so in English. So I think they just got a better reception within the English sphere than in the French one. When we are talking about French Canadian soldiers from the Battle of Hong Kong, only one person actually published his memoir in French out of something like 2,000 soldiers in total, which is Bernard Castonguay, who himself, when he came to give his own testimonials for the Canadian government, I mean, he did his testimonial in English. When he will participate with the HKVA, he will do so in English. Frankly, I'm not blaming the guy, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just like constating what happens. And one last element, because I don't want to speak too much, but one last element, I think, is how we, as historians, we dealt about the events after the Second World War in terms of in schools or just in terms of research and stuff like that. So after the Second World War, starting from I will say like maybe the 50s to the 60s, there was this big push towards social history. So basically a history from the numbers, a history from below and stuff like that. So when it came in terms of resources, there was just less of an interest towards military history in general. There was just more interest about other sphere of history, about anything else really. So when it came back to writing school manuals, historical manual for Quebec, yes, obviously they will talk about military history, but at such a lesser extent than any other else. When it came time to talk about the First World War and the Second World War, they will not really talk about the battles. They will not really talk about the experience of the veterans. They will talk about basically the construction crisis and the Dieppe raid. Basically, every event that will push this narrative between the poor French Canadian being manipulated by the English government. Yeah, they're pushing themselves as victim, exactly. So this was really more true like in the 60s and 70s, but I think also like this vision, this state of being, the state of researchers also carry on with the 80s and 90s to the 2000s, stuff like that. The idea of the push for military history, military history was always a thing. I mean, it never really stopped. But just when it came to just transmitting to school was just less popular for a long time. I think just still being carrying today. But yeah, I'm rambling. I think I'm just rambling at this point. So I'm just gonna
Thank you, Julien.
let you guys.
Thank
We,
you.
we ramble a lot. So
we do.
Yes.
We're accused of that ourselves.
Yes.
To summarize, really though, I think you nailed it on the head.
Yeah.
Is do you know the English expression? Is that it fit politically the narratives after the war, after the Second World War, to be able to shape the French Canadian participation almost as a victim, being manipulated by the English Canadian, and I think that was done at quite detriment to the actual record and the historical importance that was played by French Canadians. But so, thank you so much, gentlemen. This conversation really provided an essential overview, I think, of the challenges and the dedication and quite frankly, it's a mixed legacy, right, of the French Canadian soldier. And we've established, I think, the reluctance was more of a systemic issue. It wasn't a matter of patriotism or a lack of willingness. And Francophones, they clearly demonstrated an incredible sacrifice, despite the institutional barriers.
Yeah, and something people should really know much more about. We do a very bad job in this country of trying to educate people about that. And so thank you both for setting the stage so perfectly. For our listeners, we hope this episode has begun to shatter that misconception of unwillingness and shown that the truth is far more complex. It's a far more complex story of profound sacrifice against, well, overwhelming cultural and political odds.
That's right. And I'm hoping the listeners will join us in a future episode for what we hope to be part 2, where we're going to convince Richard to come back and present the powerful findings of his thesis, which will be revealing the true enormous scope of French-Canadian participation in the First World War.
Yes, and after that, Julien, we're going to get you back to talk us through part 3. We're exploring the tragedy and the heroism of the Quebec Battalion at the Battle of Hong Kong and the subsequent absence memorial au Québec.
Wow, look at
see, it all comes back.
There we go.
Just say it in your career, right?
That's a whole different episode.
Well, that's all for this episode of the Rum Ration podcast. Until next time, remember the extraordinary acts of ordinary people. And speaking of which, let's not forget the vital role played by French Canadians. Je me souviens. Cheers to history.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was